We've got the motor on a stand. Now we want to start taking all the components off that we have to swap over to the new motor. The first thing I'm going to take off is the alternator. I'm going to loosen this pivot bolt with the 14 millimeter. That's loose. I'm going to loosen the lock nut for the adjuster. It's a 12 millimeter. And now I can start backing off the adjuster. I'm going to get on that with my Milwaukee and speed it up. That should be plenty loose. Okay, we got the belt off. I'm just going to take this adjuster off the rest of the way. And then I'm going to take the pivot bolt out the rest of the way, and I should be able to pull this out. Little wiggle. Okay, we got our alternator out. I'm now going to remove the water neck. It's held on by three 12 millimeter nuts right here. Water neck nuts. Once you remove this, you're going to expose the thermostat, and once you remove the thermostat, some coolant might come out. So I just have a catch basin underneath here. Okay, and let's just see if I can pull this out. I'm going to have to grab on it with the little channel locks. I'm just going to grab onto this with the channel locks and rock it a little bit. Not too much coolant, just a little bit. Next, we're going to remove the upper timing cover. It's held on by 10 millimeter bolts. Oh, it's missing the bottom one there. What kind of janky thing did they do there? Oh, they broke this connector or something. They got it zip tied. This is interesting. This cam position sensor is normally plugged in right here, but they zip tied it together, which leads me to believe that it broke. So it still works, obviously, but that's interesting. Next, I'm going to remove the power steering bracket. It's held on with a 14 millimeter nut right here. I could already feel it. I think the stud's coming out of the engine. That might happen. Yeah, definitely the stud's coming out. Next, I'm going to remove the fan bracket. One of the fasteners that held it on was the power steering bracket bolt. The other two are here. Here and here. And just like the other one, the nut didn't come off the stud, so we'll have to get these nuts off the studs. And the fan bracket should just pull out like that. Next thing we're going to take off is the harmonic balancer, also known as the crank pulley. I've never really taken one off with it off the engine. Normally you hold it with this. I'm still going to go ahead and use this Schley harmonic balancer holder tool. You fit the studs into the two holes here. Make sure it's fully seated. You could get on there with the breaker bar. And I'm just going to be here just in case my impact gun wants to turn the engine. I'll be able to hold this steady. The crank bolt is a 19 millimeter. Going to use my DeWalt gun. Just like downtown. Just like we had to do in the timing belt video, this crank pulley is locked on to the crankshaft. So I have a puller from an OTC kit. I'm using a couple long M8 bolts with a 125 pitch to capture the crank pulley, and then I have the crank bolt screwed in but not all the way tight, because the bar screw is going to push on the crank bolt, and then you need a little bit of space between the crank bolt and the pulley so it'll allow it to travel back. So I'm just going to start tightening this and hopefully see that it comes back, and it is. Maybe need a little persuasion. Okay, I might have to reset this and just back out the crank bolt a little bit more. It's just coming off with my hand now. I have it loose enough. I think I could just wiggle it off the rest of the way. And there we go. The crank pulley, also known as a harmonic balancer, is off. We're now going to remove the lower timing cover. It's held on by several 10mm bolts. This is a dirty engine. We're going to remove a couple 10mm bolts that hold this starter wire bracket. So now that's free. The last thing we need to disconnect to get this starter wire harness off the engine is there's a ground strap right to the block here. It's held on with a 14mm bolt, and I'm just going to use my gear wrench ratchet to spin it off. And this whole harness is free. Next, I'm going to disconnect the connector to the crank position sensor. It's right here. You push in, pull back. That's free. And then there's a 10mm bolt that attaches it to the motor. I'm going to take this out with a box end wrench. Okay, and let's see if I can get the sensor out. There we go. And this is what the sensor looks like. I'm going to remove the alternator bracket. It's held on with a 14mm bolt right here. I'm going to remove the engine oil dipstick. I'm going to first take this out. 10mm bolt holds it to this alternator bracket right up here. And then you just pull up and it will pull right out of the oil pan. And you'll have a little O-ring here to help seal it. Next, we're going to remove the electrical connector from the oil pressure sending unit. The tab you have to push is on this side. You might find it a little difficult. We did. You push it and pull it back off. We can tuck this out of our way. This oil pressure sending unit is a 26mm. I unfortunately don't have a 26mm socket, so I'm using a big box end wrench, and we'll spin this off. Hey, a little oil came out. I'm going to disconnect the wiring harness at a bracket here right above the motor mount. It's a 10mm. Then we could just flop this over here. Next, I'm going to disconnect the oil cooler hose. It goes from the water neck all the way over here to the oil cooler. It's held on with constant tension clamps. See if I could just pull this off. Yep. Okay, and then there's another constant tension clamp over here. See if I could just twist this off. There we go, a little twist. And this is what your oil cooler hose looks like. There's another oil cooler hose right here, held on with a couple constant tension clamps. I'm going to use a straight nose needle nose pliers to release these. See if I could twist this sucker off. More coolant. That other one's going to fight me too. These pick tools are really handy. Finally got this one broken free with the pick tool, and I could pull this off. And that's what the other hose looks like. Next, I'm going to remove the oil cooler. It's held on with a 24mm bolt. There's the oil cooler bolt. Once you get the bolt out, you might find that it's a little stuck on there. Hold onto it and tap on it, and it will come free. it might just be a little bit locked on there. So a little persuasion with the mallet helps. I'm going to get the engine oil filter out of the way because I want to remove this bracket that the motor mount connects to. So I'm just going to spin this off with a wrench. There's a series of 14mm bolts that hold this onto the engine. There's one here, one right up underneath the exhaust manifold, and another one here, and that's it. There's 3 of them. The next thing I'm going to disconnect is the crossover pipe connection to the driver's side exhaust manifold. It's held on by 3 14mm nuts. Ray already pre-treated these with some penetrant. We suggest you do the same because these exhaust nuts are known to get really locked on there. I'm going to use a 14mm socket with my 1/2" drive ratchet and spin these off. I already broke them free. They were pretty tight. The stud came out on that one. We're on the passenger side of the motor and we have to disconnect the crossover pipe to the exhaust manifold on this side. There's the crossover pipe. Same thing on this side. One of the studs came out. We'll have to get that back in. The next thing I'm going to remove is this nipple that the oil cooler hose connects to. It's a 19mm. We're next going to take off this heat shield for the exhaust manifold. It's held on with a 10mm nut. A little stud came out. Oh, it's held on right here too with another one and another one here, so 3 of them. Okay, the heat shield's off. Now I'm going to remove the 14mm nuts that hold the exhaust manifold onto the driver's side of the motor. I'm just going to use my big 1/2" ratchet and a deep 14mm socket. Fingers crossed that they come off without breaking the studs. That one was easy. By the way, we pre-treated these with penetrant, or more accurately, rated. That one went, yeah, yes. Nice. There, that's one. Hey, looks like they're all going to come off. The question is now, are the studs going to come out of the heads? Let's see. Well, the first one, the stud came out. We're going to replace these anyway, so no big deal. And we're just going to do the same with the rest of them. You don't need to see it. The only one where the stud didn't come out is this back one on the top. Other than that, all the studs came out. So here is your driver's side exhaust manifold. We're going to remove this lift bracket on the driver's side. It's held on by 2 bolts, a 14mm on the bottom and a 12mm on the top. Next, I'm going to remove this alternator bracket off the motor. First, I have to remove this plate. It's held on by 2 10mm bolts. Now I have to remove 3 12mm bolts to remove this bracket off the head. Next, we're going to disconnect the oil filter union. It's a 12 millimeter Allen. I'm going to use a 12 millimeter Allen socket. That came out pretty easy.
That's what she said.
Like a hot dog in a hallway. Corn dog in Astrodome. Next, we're going to remove the AC bracket. It's held on by 5 14 millimeter bolts. 1 on the front and 4 on the side. I'm going to first break them free with a big 1/2 inch ratchet. That was the front one, that's the long one. Are these all the same size? 2 of them are longer, I should have paid attention to that. Well, this one has to go through deeper. Oh no, that one's a deeper one right there. That one's pretty close, yeah, and that one's pretty close. I think we'll figure it out because those are deeper. We're going to remove this engine hanger that we put on. They're a 14 millimeter bolt. Next, I'm going to take off the power steering bracket. It's held on by 14 millimeter bolts. There's one there, one here, and then there's one down here. We're going to get the heat shield off this passenger side exhaust manifold. 10 millimeter nuts. We're going to now remove the 14 millimeter nuts that hold the exhaust manifold on the passenger side. And the passenger side exhaust manifold's off. We're going to take this engine mount bracket off the passenger side. It's held on by 4 fasteners, 14 millimeter. One of them doubled as the bolt that holds the AC bracket on. So one of them is already out. We're going to break the other 3 free. We're going to remove this bracket that holds the transmission cooler lines to the block. It's a 14 millimeter bolt. Okay. So the next thing we're going to take off the motor is the throttle body. I'm going to disconnect a couple electrical connectors. This one in the back is to the throttle position sensor. The one on the bottom goes to the IAC valve. I'm going to disconnect this vacuum line on the top that goes to the plenum. And then I'm going to loosen 2 12 millimeter nuts and 2 12 millimeter bolts to get the throttle body loose of the plenum. Now from experience, when I want to pull this back to expose the 2 coolant lines underneath that run through the IC, I'm going to disconnect this connector to the coil pack so it has room to pull back. Okay, let's see how this goes. Oh, this hose right here is fighting me. I'm going to remove this vacuum hose down below first. See if it slides back easier now. Okay, it slides back easier. And then now we can get access to these coolant hoses. These are normally constant tension clamps, but the guy that Ray bought it from was a got rid of them, put screw down clamps. I hate when people get rid of these. I wish the guy that you bought this truck from was not a moron. We're going to get the coil packs off. We're going to take the connectors off first. We already got one off. Squeeze and pull back. There we go. We're going to disconnect the spark plug wires. What helps is to get underneath the little lip of the plastic and then lift up and then pull it up. There we go. I'm going to remove the bolts that hold the coil packs to the passenger side valve cover. They're 10 millimeter. You can just pull them right up. We're going to disconnect the PCV valve hose. It's an easy clamp, just compress it with your hand. Get a little pick tool in here to help separate it. Oh, this one is like hard as a brick. This thing needs to be replaced. Did you get that one, Ray? Oh my God, this thing is like a rock. We're going to get the upper plenum off. I have to disconnect this vacuum hose right here. And then I have a bunch of 12 millimeter bolts I have to remove. There's one here, another 3, and another couple over here. There's your upper plenum. We're now going to remove the lower plenum. It's also held on with 12 millimeter nuts and bolts. There's one here, second one here, third one here, fourth one here, and then a big long bolt that goes through the center. Before I take out the last bolt for the lower plenum, I want to get the diagnostic port disconnected from the bracket here. You just pull on a plastic tab and pull up and you can free it. And then there's a ground strap right here. It's a 10 millimeter bolt. Alright, and I'll get that last long bolt out the center and we should be able to get this free. We also got to disconnect this vacuum hose that goes to the fuel pressure regulator. There's normally a 10 millimeter bolt that holds the wiring harness to the plenum here, so you might have to remove that too. His is missing. We're going to get the spark plug wires off this driver's side valve cover. We're just going to take this hose off. We're going to reuse this and we're just going to put it right over to the new engine. Next, we're going to disconnect all the electrical connectors to the fuel injectors. Wiring harness will come off now. Oh wait a minute, we got this one connector right here, 2 connectors here that we got to disconnect. What is that one? Oh, this is the coolant temp sensor that goes to the gauge. I think it's just a simple slip-on one. There we go. Now what do you think, Ray? Let's try. Look at that, it's like a big spider. We're going to take these heater core hoses off. We already broke the clamps free, so they're going to be really easy to remove. Next, we're going to take off the fuel pressure regulator off the driver's side fuel rail. It's held on by a couple 10mm bolts. This has an O-ring that you have to overcome. Just wiggle it out. And there's the fuel pressure regulator. And some fuel coming out. Don't light a match, boys. Don't light a match. We're now going to work on getting the fuel rails off the intake manifold. There's 3 17mm bolts that we're going to break free. One here and then 2 in the front. I'm going to use a flare nut wrench because these are on tight and I don't want to strip them. Really tight. With these fuel rail connections, there's a washer on either side. We don't suggest reusing them, but if you have to in a pinch, just don't lose them when you're disconnecting these. Somebody stepped on the duck. We're now going to break free the fuel rail bolts that hold the fuel rails to the intake manifold. There's 2 on each side. The reason why we're doing this after breaking free these banjo bolts for the fuel rails is you saw it took a lot of force to break those 17mm banjo bolts loose. So if you broke the bolts free that hold the fuel rails securely to the intake manifold, then you wouldn't have very sturdy fuel rails to break those free. So that's why we're doing it second. Now we can lift the fuel rails straight up. You're going to have to overcome some resistance of the O-rings that seat the fuel injectors into the intake manifold. Just pull up and give a little wiggle. And there's one right there. We're now going to take the water inlet off the intake manifold. We're going to be reusing this intake manifold, but the reason we're doing this is because Ray's got a new gasket that goes in between the water neck and the intake manifold, so we've got to get it off. 10mm nuts. Next, we're going to remove a couple 12mm bolts for the intake manifold stay. We're now going to remove all the fasteners that hold the intake manifold to the heads. It's held on by 12 fasteners, 8 bolts, and 4 nuts. The 4 nuts are in the corners and the 8 bolts are in the middle. I'm just going to slowly break them free, corner to corner here, just like I would be doing it to tighten it. Okay, they're all loose. I'm going to zip them out with the gun. We'll have to pay attention to make sure these are all the same length. Check that one. Is it the same length?
No, it's not.
Okay, so we got to start paying attention to this then. Second one on the right. Second one on the left. Third on the right. So this is what we came up with to be organized with the intake manifold bolts, because we did notice that there's some different links, and you could see it here. We got different links, so we suggest you do the same thing. We just labeled front of the engine so we know where the 8 bolts that attach the intake manifold to the heads go. Okay, we should be able to lift this straight up. You might have to give it a little bit of persuasion. There's a lot of crap on this engine. Okay, what are we going to drop in here? Got this wiring harness. And there it is. The next thing we're going to remove is the engine coolant bypass pipe. It's held into the valley in between the heads with one 10mm nut back here and two 10mm bolts up front. And this thing should pull up. We're going to disconnect the electrical connectors to the knock sensors in here. I already was able to break one. These are going to be super brittle from the heating and cooling cycles of the motor. Luckily, Ray took the advice of Yoda One Performance and he bought a new harness, because a lot of people have problems with these trying to reuse them. And that one broke too. The little tab just broke right off. But here's the knock sensor harness that we're going to replace with a new one. We're going to remove this ground strap off the back of the passenger side head. The next thing we're going to remove is the cam position sensor. It's held on with a 10mm bolt right here. It's been a long day, but we finally finished getting everything done that we wanted to get done. We got the motor out, and we got all the parts that we need to swap over to the new engine off the old engine. And we are done with this dirty, filthy motor, and we're looking forward to working on a brand new bitchin' motor from Yoda One Performance. Yay! Yay!